In the annals of history, few deaths have been as horrifying, as grotesque, or as fitting as that of Herod the Great, the king who built monuments to his own glory, while his body slowly consumed itself from within. This is not merely a tale of political intrigue or ancient warfare, but a medical mystery wrapped in the darkest corners of human psychology, where power corrupts absolutely, and the body becomes a battlefield against its own decay. The year was 4 BCE, and the most powerful man in Judea lay writhing in agony in his palace at Jericho, his flesh literally rotting away while he still drew breath. Witnesses would later describe the smell that emanated from the royal chambers as so putrid that guards had to be rotated frequently to prevent them from vomiting at their posts. The man who had once commanded legions and built cities was now a prisoner in his own decomposing body, yet still wielding enough power to order executions with his dying breath. Herod's physician, a Greek named Ptolemy, entered the king's chamber that morning with trembling hands, carrying a mixture of oils and medicinal herbs that had proven useless against whatever curse or disease was consuming his master. "Your Majesty," Ptolemy whispered, trying not to breathe too deeply, "the new treatment from Alexandria has arrived." But Herod's response was not gratitude, it was rage. "More poison," he screamed, his voice now a raspy shadow of the commanding tone that had once struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. The transformation of Herod the Great, from a vibrant, cunning ruler into a living corpse, did not happen overnight. It was a gradual descent into a hell that seemed designed by the gods themselves as punishment for a lifetime of cruelty, paranoia, and murder. To understand how this king came to rot alive, we must first understand the man himself, a figure so complex and contradictory that historians still debate whether he was a visionary builder or a bloodthirsty tyrant. Born around 73 BCE, Herod was not even fully Jewish by blood, a fact that would haunt him throughout his reign and fuel the very paranoia that would eventually consume him. His father, Antipater, was an Idumean who had converted to Judaism, while his mother, Cyprus, was a Nabatean princess. This mixed heritage made Herod an outsider from birth, despite his family's political connections and wealth. Young Herod learned early that in a world where legitimacy was everything, he would have to fight for every scrap of respect and authority. "You will never be truly accepted," his father Antipater told him during one of their private conversations in the family villa overlooking the Mediterranean. "So you must make them fear you instead. Fear is more reliable than love, my son. Love can be withdrawn, but fear endures." These words would echo through Herod's mind for decades, shaping every decision, every relationship, and ultimately every act of violence that would define his reign. The political landscape of Herod's youth was treacherous beyond imagination. The Roman Republic was tearing itself apart in civil wars, while the various Jewish factions fought for control of their ancestral homeland. Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, Octavian. These titans of history all played roles in Herod's rise to power, and he navigated between them with a cunning that was both masterful and morally bankrupt. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Herod seamlessly transferred his allegiance to Mark Antony. When Antony fell to Octavian at the Battle of Actium, Herod somehow convinced the future Emperor Augustus that he deserved to keep his throne. This political shapeshifting required a particular kind of personality, one willing to sacrifice anything and anyone for survival. Herod's first wife, Doris, was quickly divorced. When it became politically advantageous to marry Mariamne, a princess from the Hasmonean dynasty, who could provide him with the Jewish legitimacy he desperately craved. But even this marriage, which should have been a source of happiness and stability, became poisoned by Herod's paranoia and jealousy. Mariamne was by all accounts a woman of extraordinary beauty and intelligence. But she was also proud and unafraid to remind Herod of his inferior bloodline. During their early years of marriage, their conversations often crackled with tension. "You may wear the crown," Mariamne once told him during a heated argument about his building projects, "but you will never possess the royal blood that flows through my veins." Her words cut deeper than any sword, feeding the insecurities that would later metastasize into murderous rage. The couple had 2 sons together, Alexander and Aristobulus, who inherited their mother's Hasmonean features and their father's political acumen. For a time it seemed that Herod had achieved what he had always desired, a dynasty that combined his cunning with legitimate royal blood. But paranoia is a cancer that grows in darkness, and Herod's mind was becoming an increasingly dark place. The first signs of Herod's future physical decay may have appeared much earlier than historians previously believed, manifesting initially as psychological symptoms that modern medical experts might recognize as the early stages of a systemic disease affecting both mind and body. Ancient sources describe episodes where Herod would fly into uncontrollable rages over minor perceived slights, his face turning purple with fury, spittle flying from his mouth as he screamed accusations of conspiracy and betrayal. His sister Salome, a woman as ruthlessly ambitious as Herod himself, became his closest advisor and often the voice whispering poisonous suggestions in his ear. "Brother," she would say during their private meetings in the palace gardens, "Mariamne speaks too freely of her royal blood. The people whisper that her sons would make better kings than you. Perhaps it is time to consider alternatives." These conversations held beneath the olive trees that Herod had planted to beautify his palace grounds were planning sessions for some of the most heinous murders in ancient history. The building projects that would make Herod famous throughout the ancient world were not merely expressions of architectural ambition, they were desperate attempts to create a legacy that would outlast his physical body and prove his worthiness to history. The expansion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem was a marvel of engineering and artistic vision, but it was also a political masterstroke designed to win over the Jewish population who still viewed him as a foreign usurper. Standing before the Temple Mount, surrounded by hundreds of workers hauling massive stone blocks into place, Herod often felt a momentary reprieve from the dark thoughts that increasingly consumed his mind. "This will stand for 1,000 years, he declared to his chief architect, a man named Marcus, who had studied in Rome. "When kings are forgotten, when empires fall, this temple will remind the world that Herod the Great once lived and ruled with wisdom." The irony, of course, was that the same paranoia driving his building projects was simultaneously destroying the very legacy he hoped to create. The fortress palace of Masada, perched impossibly on a plateau in the Judean desert, represented perhaps the purest expression of Herod's psychology. Here was a refuge that could withstand any siege, stocked with enough food and water to last for years, surrounded by walls that seemed to touch the sky itself. But Masada was also a prison, a place where Herod could retreat when the world became too threatening, when the faces of friends and family began to look like those of enemies. During one of his retreats to Masada, Herod received disturbing reports from his spies in Jerusalem. His beloved wife Mariamne had been heard expressing doubts about his fitness to rule, questioning his decisions in front of other members of the royal court. The messenger, a nervous young man named Joseph, delivered this intelligence while Herod stood on the fortress walls, staring out at the Dead Sea far below. "Are you certain of this?" Herod asked, his voice eerily calm. "Your Majesty," Joseph replied, "I heard her words with my own ears." What happened next revealed the true depth of Herod's psychological deterioration. Rather than confronting Mariamne directly or investigating the claims further, Herod began constructing an elaborate trap. He would test his wife's loyalty in a way that no rational person would consider, by faking his own death and observing her reaction from hiding. This bizarre plan required the cooperation of several trusted advisors, all of whom were too terrified of their king to point out the obvious flaws in his reasoning. The fake death plot unfolded over several weeks, with Herod's supporters spreading carefully crafted rumors about his demise while he remained hidden in a secret chamber within the palace. When Mariamne learned of her husband's supposed death, her reaction was not the grief that Herod expected, but relief. She was overheard saying to her servants, At last, we are free of the tyrant. These words, reported back to the very much alive Herod, sealed her fate and marked the beginning of his descent into the madness that would characterize his final year. The execution of Mariamne in 29 BCE was not a moment of triumph for Herod, but the beginning of a psychological collapse that would mirror the physical deterioration that was already beginning to ravage his body. According to the historian Josephus, Herod's behavior immediately after his wife's death became erratic and disturbing. He would call out her name in the middle of the night, ordering servants to fetch her, apparently forgetting that he had ordered her execution just days earlier. The palace physician who served Herod during this period, a man named Andromachus, left detailed notes that provide crucial insights into the king's declining mental and physical state. His Majesty suffers from terrible dreams, Andromachus wrote. He awakens screaming, claiming to see Mariamne standing at the foot of his bed, her eyes filled with blood. His appetite has diminished greatly, and I have observed a tremor in his hands that was not present before the queen's death. These physical symptoms, the tremors, the loss of appetite, the sleep disturbances, may have been early manifestations of the disease process that would eventually consume Herod's body entirely. Modern medical experts, who have studied the ancient accounts of Herod's illness, suggest that he may have suffered from chronic kidney disease, possibly complicated by diabetes, and what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety disorder. But Herod's paranoia and cruelty were far from finished. Having eliminated his beloved wife, he now turned his suspicions toward his own children. Alexander and Aristobulus, Mariamne's sons, were young men of exceptional promise, educated in Rome, and well regarded by the Jewish population for their mother's royal bloodline. In any normal royal family, they would have been celebrated as the future of the dynasty. In Herod's twisted mind, they became the most dangerous threats to his power. The psychological dynamic between Herod and his sons became a grotesque parody of normal family relationships. During formal dinners in the palace, with dozens of guests present, Herod would suddenly turn to Alexander and demand, "Tell me, my son, do you dream of wearing your father's crown?" The young man, perhaps 20 years old at the time, would try to deflect with humor or protests of loyalty. But Herod's eyes would remain fixed on him with an intensity that made everyone present deeply uncomfortable. Salome, Herod's sister, continued to pour poison into his ear regarding his son's loyalty. She fabricated letters, supposedly written by Alexander to the Roman general in Syria, letters that suggested the young prince was seeking outside support for a rebellion against his father. When these forgeries were presented to Herod, his reaction was not investigation or verification, but immediate and absolute belief in his son's guilt. The trial of Alexander and Aristobulus was a mockery of justice that revealed how completely Herod had lost touch with reality. Held in Beirut before a Roman tribunal, the proceedings were dominated, not by evidence, but by Herod's rambling accusations and emotional outbursts. "They plot against me in my own house," he shouted at the Roman judges. "They smile at my table, while sharpening their knives in darkness." The young men, displaying a dignity that their father had long since abandoned, maintained their innocence throughout the proceedings. Augustus Caesar himself attempted to mediate the family dispute, recognizing that Herod's paranoia was becoming a threat to regional stability. In a letter preserved by ancient historians, Augustus wrote to Herod, "It would be better to be Herod's pig than his son, for the pig has a better chance of survival." This dark joke reflected the emperor's growing concern about his client king's mental state, but it was already too late for intervention. The execution of Alexander and Aristobulus in 7 BCE marked a turning point not only in Herod's psychological deterioration, but also in his physical decline. Several ancient sources note that immediately after his sons' deaths, Herod's health took a dramatic turn for the worse. The tremors in his hands became more pronounced. His skin took on a yellowish pallor, and he began to complain of intense abdominal pain that no physician could relieve. It was during this period that the first unmistakable signs of the horrific disease process that would eventually kill Herod began to manifest. Court records from the time describe episodes where the king would suddenly double over in agony, clutching his stomach and screaming for hours at a time. His personal servants reported finding blood in his urine and feces, and a foul odor began to emanate from his body that grew stronger with each passing month. The ancient physician Ptolemy, who had studied medicine in Alexandria and Athens, was summoned to examine the ailing king. His diagnostic notes, preserved in fragments of papyrus discovered by archaeologists, provide a chilling medical record of Herod's condition. The king's abdomen is distended and hard to the touch, Ptolemy wrote. His urine is dark and bloody, and his breath carries the scent of corruption. I fear his body is consuming itself from within. Modern medical experts who have analyzed these ancient descriptions believe that Herod was suffering from chronic kidney disease, possibly caused by diabetes or an autoimmune condition. The corruption that Ptolemy detected was likely the result of uremia, a condition where the kidneys fail to filter toxins from the blood, causing a buildup of waste products that literally poison the body from within. But the physical deterioration was accompanied by an acceleration of Herod's paranoid delusions. He became convinced that his food was being poisoned and would only eat meals prepared by a handful of trusted servants, all of whom were forced to taste each dish before it was presented to the king. Even then, Herod would often refuse to eat, claiming that he could detect the bitter taste of treachery in everything that was offered to him. The palace became a place of constant surveillance and suspicion, where every whispered conversation was reported to the king and every glance was interpreted as evidence of conspiracy. Herod's remaining son, Antipater, who had initially benefited from his half-brother's elimination, soon found himself under the same cloud of suspicion that had destroyed the rest of the royal family. During this period of escalating paranoia, Herod ordered the construction of a series of underground tunnels beneath his various palaces, convinced that his enemies were planning to attack him from below. Teams of workers, sworn to secrecy on pain of death, labored day and night to create these subterranean escape routes. The king would spend hours wandering through these tunnels, sometimes becoming lost and requiring search parties to locate him. The physical symptoms of Herod's disease continued to worsen with each passing month. His legs began to swell with fluid retention, a condition known as edema, that indicated his kidneys were failing to process the body's waste products effectively. The swelling was so severe that special shoes had to be crafted for him, and he could no longer stand for extended periods without experiencing excruciating pain. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the development of what ancient sources describe as worms or corruption in Herod's genital area. Medical historians believe this was likely a form of gangrene or severe infection that caused the tissue to literally rot away while the king was still alive. The smell from this condition became so overwhelming that servants had to burn incense constantly in his presence. And even then, many could not remain in the same room for more than a few minutes at a time. The psychological impact of watching his own body decay while still conscious and alert pushed Herod into new depths of cruelty and madness. He ordered the execution of several physicians who had failed to cure his condition, convinced that they were part of a conspiracy to prolong his suffering. One doctor, a Jewish healer named Simon, was reportedly thrown from the walls of Jericho after suggesting that Herod's condition might be divine punishment for his sins. As word of Herod's horrific condition spread throughout his kingdom, various factions began positioning themselves for the succession crisis that would inevitably follow his death. The Jewish religious leaders, who had long resented Herod's foreign origins and brutal methods, began to speak more openly of their hope for a native-born king. Roman officials in Syria started making contingency plans for maintaining order in the event of Herod's sudden death. But Herod, despite his physical deterioration, remained mentally sharp enough to perceive these political maneuverings. His response was characteristically violent and paranoid. He ordered the arrest of prominent Jewish leaders throughout his kingdom, claiming they were plotting rebellion. Hundreds of men were imprisoned without trial, and many were executed on the basis of rumors and denunciations from anonymous informants. The arrest and imprisonment of so many respected citizens created a climate of terror throughout Judea that was unlike anything the region had experienced even during Herod's previous purges. Families were torn apart as fathers and sons were dragged from their homes in the middle of the night. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing decades later, described this period as a time when trust died, and every man looked upon his neighbor with suspicion. In the midst of this chaos, Herod received intelligence that would lead to one of his final and most heinous acts of violence. His spies reported that his son Antipater, whom he had designated as his heir after eliminating his other children, was secretly communicating with Roman officials about plans for the succession. Whether this intelligence was accurate or simply another product of Herod's diseased imagination, it triggered a final explosion of murderous rage. The confrontation between Herod and Antipater took place in the king's bedchamber at Jericho, with only a handful of guards present as witnesses. According to their later testimony, Herod, despite being barely able to stand without assistance, somehow found the strength to attack his son with a ceremonial dagger. Antipater, caught completely off guard by his father's sudden violence, suffered several wounds before the guards could intervene. "You would rob me even of death itself," Herod screamed at his bleeding son. "You circle like a vulture, waiting for my last breath so you can steal what I have built." Antipater, bleeding from multiple wounds, attempted to defend himself, but his father's rage was beyond reason. Within hours, orders had been sent out for Antipater's execution, making him the last in a long line of Herod's murdered family members. The execution of Antipater left Herod without a clear successor, and the kingdom in a state of complete uncertainty. Various minor members of the royal family and their supporters began making claims to different portions of Herod's territory, while Roman officials prepared to intervene if necessary to maintain order. But Herod, lying in his bed of pain and corruption, was not finished with his subjects yet. In what may have been his most psychologically revealing act, Herod ordered the arrest of the most prominent and beloved citizens from every town and city in his kingdom. These men, teachers, merchants, religious leaders, and community elders were brought to the hippodrome in Jericho and imprisoned there under heavy guard. Herod's plan was simple and horrifying. The moment he died, all of these innocent men would be executed, ensuring that his death would be marked by mourning rather than celebration. "Let them weep," Herod told his sister Salome, who had come to visit him in his final illness. "Let the whole kingdom weep when Herod dies. If they will not mourn for me, then they shall mourn." The logic of this plan revealed the complete disconnection from reality that characterized Herod's final month. He could not conceive that genuine grief might be earned through kindness and good governance. Instead, he sought to manufacture mourning through terror and mass murder. The physical deterioration that had been progressing for years now accelerated dramatically. Ancient sources describe Herod's body as literally falling apart, while he remained conscious and aware of every horrifying detail. His skin developed what physicians described as an intolerable itching that caused him to scratch himself until he bled. The scratching became so compulsive that his hands had to be restrained to prevent him from tearing his flesh to ribbons. The smell emanating from Herod's body became so powerful that even the palace animals avoided the areas where he spent time. Dogs, normally attracted to human presence, would flee when they caught his scent. Birds that had once nested in the palace gardens abandoned their nests and sought other locations. The very air around Herod seemed to carry the stench of death and decay. Ancient medical texts describe Herod's condition during his final weeks as unprecedented in their experience. His feet and legs were so swollen with fluid that they resembled tree trunks more than human limbs. The skin had become translucent in places, revealing the dark fluid that had collected beneath. When physicians attempted to drain this fluid, it would return within hours, often worse than before. The psychological torture of being trapped in such a body while remaining mentally alert was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Herod's condition. He could feel every sensation of decay, could smell his own corruption, could see the horror and disgust in the eyes of those who attended him. Yet his mind remained sharp enough to understand exactly what was happening to him, and to remember all the actions that had brought him to this point. During lucid moments, Herod would sometimes speak to his physicians about his condition with surprising clinical detachment. Tell me, Ptolemy, he once asked his Greek doctor, have you ever seen a man rot away while still breathing? Is this condition described in your medical texts? When Ptolemy admitted that he had never encountered anything similar, Herod laughed bitterly. Then I am making history even in my dying. Future physicians will study the death of Herod the Great. The final weeks of Herod's life were marked by desperate attempts to find relief from his suffering. He traveled to the hot springs at Calirho, hoping that the mineral waters might provide some healing for his diseased body. The journey itself was an ordeal, requiring a specially constructed litter and frequent stops to tend to his worsening condition. The hot springs provided no relief. If anything, the heat seemed to accelerate the decomposition process, causing new areas of his body to develop the characteristic odor and appearance of gangrene. The physicians accompanying Herod on this final journey reported that the smell became so overwhelming that they had to position themselves upwind of the king at all times. It was during his stay at Calirho that Herod made his final major decision regarding the succession. Perhaps recognizing that his plan to execute the kingdom's leading citizens was too extreme, even by his standards, or perhaps simply too weak to carry it through, he revised his will to divide his territory among his surviving sons. This last-minute change would lead to decades of conflict, and ultimately contribute to the eventual destruction of his dynasty. The return journey to Jericho was a nightmare march through the desert, with Herod's condition deteriorating with each mile. Servants reported that by the time they reached the palace, the king was barely conscious and his body had begun to emit a greenish fluid that stained everything it touched. The corruption that had been consuming him from within was now visible on the surface, marking his transformation from a living man into a walking corpse. In his final days, Herod's behavior alternated between periods of unconsciousness and moments of startling lucidity. During one such moment, he summoned his sister Salome and gave her strict instructions about the executions he had planned at the Hippodrome. But even Salome, who had supported her brother's cruelest acts throughout his reign, was horrified by this final command and secretly decided to ignore it. The physical process of Herod's death was as horrific as his life had been cruel. Ancient sources describe his final breath as being accompanied by a sound like air escaping from a punctured wineskin, suggesting that his internal organs had literally begun to decompose before his heart stopped beating. The smell that had plagued his final months became so intense in his last hours that even the guards stationed outside his chamber had to be relocated to prevent them from becoming ill. When Herod finally died in 4 BCE, the news was initially kept secret for several days while arrangements were made for the succession and for dealing with the hundreds of prisoners he had ordered executed. Salome, true to her decision to defy her brother's final command, ordered the prisoners released, creating a moment of unexpected mercy in what had been a reign defined by cruelty and paranoia. The preparation of Herod's body for burial presented unique challenges due to the advanced state of decomposition that had occurred while he was still alive. Traditional embalming techniques proved inadequate, and special precautions had to be taken to contain the odor during the funeral procession. Even in death, Herod remained a source of horror and revulsion to those around him. The funeral of Herod the Great was a spectacle of contradictions, magnificent in its ceremony yet overshadowed by the grotesque reality of the corpse at its center. The procession from Jericho to the Herodium where he had chosen to be buried was accompanied by hundreds of mourners, but many were there out of duty or fear rather than genuine grief. The golden crown placed on Herod's head and the purple robes draped over his decomposed body created a surreal image of majesty corrupted by mortality. The immediate aftermath of Herod's death brought the political chaos that everyone had anticipated. His kingdom was divided among his surviving sons, leading to decades of conflict and instability. The Romans, who had supported Herod as a useful client king, found themselves dealing with multiple petty rulers who lacked their father's political cunning and administrative competence. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Herod's death was not political but psychological. The horrific manner of his dying became a cautionary tale that spread throughout the ancient world. A reminder that power without mercy, paranoia without limit, and cruelty without conscience could transform even a king into something less than human. The medical mystery of Herod's condition continued to fascinate physicians and scholars for centuries after his death. Some saw it as divine punishment for his crimes, while others sought natural explanations for the unprecedented symptoms he had displayed. Modern medical analysis suggests that he suffered from a combination of chronic kidney disease, diabetes, and possibly an autoimmune condition that created the perfect storm for his body's systematic self-destruction. The psychological dimension of Herod's final years offers equally compelling insights into the corrupting effects of absolute power. His paranoia, which began as a survival mechanism in the dangerous political environment of his time, eventually became a mental prison that isolated him from human connection and drove him to destroy everything he claimed to love. The legacy of Herod the Great remains complex and contradictory to this day. His architectural achievements, including the expansion of the Second Temple and the construction of Caesarea Maritima, stood as monuments to human ingenuity and ambition for centuries. Yet these same achievements are forever tainted by the memory of the man who commissioned them. A king whose final years demonstrated that power without compassion leads inevitably to destruction. The story of how Herod rotted alive while still wearing a crown serves as one of history's most graphic illustrations of the principle that those who live by violence and fear will ultimately be consumed by the very forces they have unleashed. In seeking to preserve his power through murder and paranoia, Herod destroyed not only his family and his kingdom, but ultimately his own humanity. As we reflect on this bizarre and horrifying case from ancient history, we are reminded that the corruption of power is not merely metaphorical but can become literally physically manifest. Herod's body became the outward expression of the moral decay that had consumed his soul, creating a death that was as grotesque and memorable as his life had been cruel and paranoid. The king who had once commanded armies and built cities ended his days as a walking advertisement for the wages of sin, a man whose physical decay mirrored the spiritual corruption that had defined his reign. In death, as in life, Herod the Great achieved a kind of immortality, not as the glorious ruler he had hoped to be remembered as, but as history's most perfect example of how power corrupts, paranoia destroys, and cruelty ultimately consumes those who practice it. His death marked not just the end of a life, but the end of an era in which individual rulers could wield absolute power over the lives and deaths of their subjects. The revulsion that Herod's death inspired contributed to changing attitudes about the nature of kingship and the responsibilities that come with power. The bizarre case of the king who rotted alive remains one of history's most compelling and disturbing stories, a reminder that in the end we are all mortal, and that the manner of our dying often reflects the manner of our living. Herod the Great achieved immortality through his death, but not in the way he had planned. Instead of being remembered as a glorious conqueror, he is remembered as a cautionary tale about the ultimate fate of those who choose cruelty over compassion, paranoia over trust, and power over love.